On April 8th of 2016, Elon Musk was able to create history once again. His Falcon 9 rocket, named after Millennium Falcon in Star Wars, was able to self-land on the drone ship by the name of course, I Still Love You. Today we'll talk about SpaceX and Falcon 9 rockets, and we're going to explore the future of this beautiful and somewhat unusual rocket known as Falcon 9. Welcome to What the Math, and enjoy the video. And I'm going to be using Kerbal Space Program to try to recreate my own Falcon 9 launch, and I'm obviously going to fail landing it. Just warning you in advance, don't expect me to land this beautiful rocket back onto the barge because it is so difficult, but you are welcome to try it yourself. Anyway, so let's actually talk about various facts and various historical tidbits about SpaceX. And first and foremost, so what is this rocket? It's a two-stage rocket that has a first stage that has very powerful Merlin D engines. There's actually 9 of them. And this first stage is able to land itself back to Earth. And the second stage only has one Merlin D engine, and unfortunately is not able to return back and is usually lost on re-entry from orbit. And all of these rockets are manufactured by the privately held SpaceX company, which was founded by Elon Musk back in 2001. And as of April of 2016, there were 24 launches, and only one of these launches was actually a failure. Specifically here, this was on June of 2015 when a rocket that was launched by SpaceX disintegrated due to a failure within its tank. But despite this failure, SpaceX has not failed and actually has been going and growing stronger and bigger. And as a matter of fact, a few months after this failure, on December 21st of 2015, another Falcon 9 rocket was able to successfully land on the landing zone 1 at Cape Canaveral, and this was actually the first successful recovery of a rocket after a successful launch to orbit. And considering that only a few years prior to this, Musk actually said that if a vehicle does not become reusable, I will consider us to have failed, it's actually quite surprising that it only took him a few years to successfully land a rocket back on the planet. And this is not actually the end of achievements for SpaceX. This company has actually achieved quite a lot of firsts. This company created the first privately funded liquid fuel rocket, and here we're talking about Falcon 1, which launched in September of 2008. This is also the first privately funded company to successfully launch and recover a spacecraft. This is also the first private company to successfully send a spacecraft by the name of Dragon to the International Space Station for essentially restocking. And so NASA, which no longer restocks International Space Station, now uses SpaceX for this purpose. It's also a first private company to send a geosynchronous orbit satellite, and of course the first to successfully land a first stage back on the planet, not only on land but now also in the middle of the ocean on a tiny little barge. And this of course is a tremendous achievement, not only for the company but for humanity as a whole. Now, for Elon Musk, the eventual goal is to essentially create a rocket that can deliver payloads into orbit under about $500 per pound, which is ridiculously cheap when you think about it. It's essentially $1,100 per kilogram, which is about 10 times lower than the price currently. And his eventual goal is to not only go to Mars, but to essentially establish a kind of a space route to Mars where millions of people per year can essentially just go to Mars, settle there, colonize Mars, and live there. He even stated that he would like to one day die on Mars, but not from crash landing onto the planet, from actually living there. And to be honest, I don't think this is a far-fetched announcement because as of 2012, SpaceX has already launched over 40 different satellites. It's already become the cheapest possible rocket to launch satellites, and many other companies, including the French company that usually launches Ariane 5 rockets and the Russian company that launches Proton M rockets, have already lost a lot of clients to SpaceX because it's simply cheaper to launch with them. And on top of that, in January of 2015, SpaceX announced that they're also going to start making their own satellites, also cheaper than other companies. And currently SpaceX has something like 50 future contracts already signed that are basically paying off the construction of future rockets. Now, currently, the launch of one rocket costs about $56 million, and this is to launch a rocket to low Earth orbit. But this is already something like $10 to $15 million cheaper than launching the same thing with the Russians or the French. Or, if you want to compare it even further, even the Chinese. And since Falcon 9 is now technically a reusable rocket, this price may eventually fall down to about $7 to $9 million per launch, which is actually 10 times cheaper than any other rocket available. Now, does this mean that other companies will go out of business? I don't think so. I think what will happen eventually is that other private companies and possibly other government companies will start investing into innovation rather than just trying to launch old rockets that are literally like 50 years old in terms of technologies used. And here I'm talking about the Soyuz rocket that essentially hasn't really changed much in decades. And only a few months ago, Arianespace, which is a company responsible for launching Ariane 5 with the European Space Agency, has already announced that, you know what, this may likely create a lot of competition and obviously challenge for us, but at the same time will lead to a lot of restructuring and reorganization within all other space agencies around the world. And what's really, really interesting is that this is the first year in decades that no commercial launches were actually booked for either the Russian or the Ukrainian service providers, which are usually considered to be the cheapest. So almost all of them were basically booked with SpaceX. And one of the reasons for this sudden increase in SpaceX efficiency is actually because they've looked at their old rockets and they've analyzed their version 1.0 and version 1.1 Falcon 9 rockets and realized that there's a way for them to improve efficiency by 30% if they actually cool down the oxygen that is used as a propellant and the rocket propellant that is also used on this particular rocket. If they actually cool it down, they'll be able to essentially fit in more of this stuff inside the rocket because it actually decreases or increases density and decreases the volume used. So they've actually been able to squeeze in a lot more oxygen and a lot more propellants into the same rocket, and essentially now call this design full thrust. And this is the design that's 30% more efficient and can actually launch even larger yields to orbit. And the first of these rockets flew on December of 2015, and this was also the first rocket to actually then land back safely onto land. But what's really cool about this particular design is that in its first stage, because it has 9 engines, and this is actually similar to kind of how Saturn and Apollo programs worked, because of these multi-engine first stage designs, this particular rocket can actually function even if one of its engines fails. And this actually did happen in October of 2012. So if one of the engines decides to stop working, the rocket can still essentially keep flying, and it did fly continuously, and it actually delivered the satellite to orbit. So the failure for this rocket is, or the chance for failure for this rocket is actually relatively low. Now, in comparison to the Russian Soyuz series, it's kind of difficult to compare them actually, but for Soyuz, after 1700 launches, it has a failure rate of about 1 in 39. For this design, there was technically 1 failure out of about 24 launches in total, so 1 in 24 is not so bad after all, and this will most likely increase as SpaceX gets more and more missions under its belt. And currently what SpaceX is planning to do is, first of all, they're planning to start launching something called Falcon Heavy, which is something we'll talk about in the next video. And they also are planning to start launching actual astronauts to International Space Station and take over from the Russians once again, because this is essentially one of their main plans. They want to start launching commercial crew and acquire a license for human-rated spacecraft capable of delivering crew to space, essentially. But I think if there's anything to learn from this story of SpaceX success and Elon Musk persistence, is really the fact that even despite many failures and despite all of these tremendous challenges he had to face, he actually was able to succeed after something like 15 years. Now, what's really cool is that back in 2001, he actually conceptualized something called Mars Oasis. He actually wanted to launch a rocket with a bunch of plants and a bunch of seeds and something called dehydrated gel, which would then essentially land on Mars and let the plants grow in Martian soil. Now, this, as he later realized, was not as easy as he imagined, and so in 2001 he actually traveled to Moscow and tried to purchase refurbished ICBMs, because he wanted to launch or tried to launch his first rockets and essentially just tried to build up his own private rocket that he would then try to launch to Mars. But using a bit of math and a bit of calculation, he realized that it was not as easy as he thought it would be. And so after another visit to Moscow, where essentially people just laughed at him, saying he was an amateur and that he was not willing to pay a lot of money for rockets that were a lot more expensive, he kind of just decided to go in a completely different direction and overcome this challenge by not just trying to look for more companies, but essentially by starting his own company that he later called SpaceX. And after his unusual trip to Moscow, he decided to apply the principle of vertical integration from economics, which essentially states that in order for you to save money when constructing something, you have to try to arrange your supply chain so that everything is owned by your own company. So essentially, if you're building things, if you're building parts, and all of those parts are constructed by your own company, you will save the most amount of money. And then he actually calculated that the raw materials for building a rocket were only about 3% of the sales price of a rocket. So he realized that using his own money, he could construct rockets much cheaper. And since he found a company in late 2001 or early 2002, his company grew from something like 160 employees in 2005 to more than 5,000 employees by essentially today, by April of 2016. And the goal of the company hasn't changed at all. He still has the goal of colonizing Mars and essentially sending those little plants that he wanted to send and making them grow in the Martian soil. So this story to me is absolutely incredible and very inspirational. So even though some people call him the Iron Man of our generation, I personally think that Elon Musk is a practical dreamer. He's a person who has a dream but is able to actually achieve it and will probably not stop despite any kind of challenges to try to get to where he actually wants to be. And here, this is where I absolutely admire him, because his persistence, despite all of the challenges, is incredible. Anyway, so that's all I wanted to say in this video. I hope that you learn a little bit more about SpaceX and Falcon 9 rocket. And in one of the future videos, we're going to talk about the future of his company and where they're going with their Falcon Heavy design as well. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe if you enjoy watching different space videos.